Hi everyone, welcome back to the webinar series on women and activism in Ireland. Today we have the pleasure to host two wonderful speakers. Dr. Tricia Keilthy, she's the head of social justice and policy at the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, SVP, and she also adjunct assistant professor at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice at the University College Dublin. And Kiernan has been the CEO of One Family since 2001, and she's also a former graduate of Women's Studies at UCC. So welcome back. And so we're going to have, I think, Tricia first, and then Karen afterwards. So I'll let Tricia take the floor, and then we're going to move to Karen. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak here today. I suppose just by way of background, I would have my first job when I finished college. My master's was with One Family, and I would have worked there on issues related to lone parents and employment, and also contact post-education for lone parents as well. And then I would have done my PhD in UCD, and again I would have focused on family dynamics, child well-being and inequality, and I would have used data from Ireland, the UK and Denmark, and looking at the different ways states support families and how that makes a difference for families and children. I've been with SVP now for 4 years, and a key focus of the work of SVP is obviously advocating for social justice, and a key part of that is in relation to issues affecting one-parent families. So about 70% of the requests we receive are from households with children, and the majority of those are headed by one parent, usually a mother parenting alone. So it's a core area of concern for SVP, and it's an area that we've worked on in our own right, and also collectively with other organisations like One Family and Spark. And Karen will speak afterwards just about the newly formed National One Parent Family Alliance, which has emerged from COVID, given the disproportionate impact the pandemic has had on one parent families. So by way of introduction, I'm just going to do a short overview of the issues affecting one parent families, and give it some stats and insight into the issues that are affecting parents prior to the pandemic, and the reasons why they've been more vulnerable to the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic as well. So I just have a few slides which I might just share, which is not working. It's not coming up for some reason.
If you go on that little arrow, that little share content, you know, where you have the microphone, and then you go into share content on the right.
Yeah, it's not bringing. It says no PowerPoint.
See the PowerPoint. What you can do is you can open the PowerPoint on your desktop, and then you can share your screen.
Can you see that now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. So yeah, just to start, I suppose one parent families, about 1 in 4 families are headed by one parent in Ireland, but lone parent families are disproportionately represented in the numbers experiencing consistent poverty. So about 40% of families who are in consistent poverty are headed by one parent, and about 60% of families who are homeless are headed by one parent as well. So those two issues are predominantly affecting lone parent families, and there's a number of factors that are driving high rates of poverty and homelessness among lone parents in Ireland today. So I think obviously the first issue is how the social welfare system is set up in Ireland, in that we have a male breadwinner model, which means that we have historically low rates of investment in childcare, and we have low replacement rates for social welfare payments. We don't have individualised payments, and we have a system that's set up to support a 2-parent traditional family, which means that the unique needs and additional supports of lone parents aren't adequately supported through our social protection system. And it's in terms of work and pay, lone parents are more likely to be underemployed, so they're more likely to be in part-time work, and that obviously is linked to being both the primary caregiver and the primary earner for their family. And the lack of childcare means that flexible or part-time work is the only option for them. And because the jobs that are flexible tend to be also low paid, means that lone parents are more likely to be employed on the national minimum wage, which also then limits their ability to make ends meet from work. Also, a second issue is that lone parents have difficulties in accessing education. So, for example, the SUSI system isn't set up for the needs of lone parents. If you're studying part-time, you can't access the SUSI grant, which makes it very difficult for parents who want to go back to education, but they can't balance that with their caring responsibilities and employment responsibilities as well. The other factor is that we have inadequate social welfare supports. So most social welfare rates are set at a level that is below what is required to meet a minimum essential standard of living. And research from the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice shows that households with the deepest level of inadequacy tend to be households headed by one parent. So if you are reliant only on social welfare supports or in-work supports, you are unable to meet a minimum standard of living. And that's why 45% of one-parent families are experiencing forced deprivation, which means they're regularly going without basics like food, adequate heat and suitable clothing. And I suppose that's why we have such a high rate of lone parents contacting SVP for help with those very basics. And again, that's also related to the final factor in that Ireland has very high living costs, and particularly related to childcare. We know that among OECD countries, lone parents pay some of the highest childcare rates among developed countries. And also we have a housing crisis, high rents. The housing assistance payment, isn't adequate in supporting lone parent families. They often have to pay a top up, which means they're cutting back on other basics to make ends meet. And that also puts them at risk of homelessness, and why they're overrepresented in homeless statistics as well. So just in terms of work and care, the employment rate of lone parents is among the lowest among EU peer countries at 58%. And I suppose it's also Ireland generally has a low rate of maternal employment. So even in women in two-parent families have some of the lowest rates of employment as well. But again, that disproportionately impacts lone parents who are struggling with childcare costs and balancing work and family life as well. But we know, if you look at the stats at how employment changes over the course of their children's lives, we know that when childcare responsibilities are lower, employment rates are higher among lone parents. So, for example, 66% of parents with children over the age of 12 are at work. So it really is linked to the access to childcare as a critical issue for lone parents as well. So as I mentioned, lone parents are more likely to be in precarious work, and they're more likely to be in temporary contracts. So this has made lone parents particularly vulnerable during COVID, because the job losses have been primarily in lower paid sectors of the economy. So, for example, retail and hospitality, lone parents tend to be employed in. So now we're concerned collectively as an alliance about the risk of long-term unemployment for lone parents, because over the last number of years there has been increases in employment among lone parents, and we're worried that a lot of those gains may be rolled back now as we emerge from COVID. But Karen will speak more in detail about those specific concerns next. The childcare issue, 60% of lone parents say they can't access childcare services for financial reasons. And the rollout of the National Childcare Scheme has been positive, but again, this goes back to policy in Ireland understanding the needs of lone parents and not adequately reflecting the needs of lone parents in the design of policy. So, for example, the new National Childcare Scheme actually makes some lone parents worse off than under old schemes because it wasn't properly poverty-proofed when it was rolled out. So that's a continuing issue for the group in terms of the work that we're focusing on. And then the final point, and then this is also really important for COVID and the impact that it had. Research from the ESRI, recent research showed that lone parents are more likely to be employed in essential work. So the slow rollout of childcare during the first lockdown meant that some lone parents had to leave their jobs because they couldn't attend work because there was no childcare during those initial phases again as well. So that's a continuing issue during this lockdown as well, and it's something that we've raised with the Minister for Children. So just in terms of the welfare piece and income inadequacy, it's very well documented that lone parents bore the brunt of the austerity cuts, and it had a really detrimental impact on families during that time. We would have seen a dramatic increase in requests from lone parents during the height of austerity. And that can be obviously linked to the changes and cuts to the one-parent family payment. And at the time, it was sold as a way of improving the labour market attachment of lone parents, but groups like One Family and SVP at the time would have been very critical of the move, because it was forcing lone parents into work at a time when unemployment was very high, where childcare still wasn't available, and it also removed a lot of the features of the one-parent family payment that supported part-time work, which obviously was the preference and only choice for lone parents at that time as well. So it actually reduced the income of lone parents who are at work. So while we can see that employment rates have increased, but actually at the same time the rate of in-work poverty more than doubled between 2012 and 2019, from 9% up to 20%. So that means 1 in 5 lone parents are who are at work are working below the poverty line. So again, there has been a huge campaigning work around the one-parent reforms. And under Regina Doherty, we would have engaged, all groups would have engaged with her on an ongoing basis about the difficulties that the changes caused. And there was some of those cuts have been undone in budgets 2018, 2019 and 2020. And I think, the earning disregards and the in-work supports have been increased and actually gone beyond what they were previously, which was really important. But I think there's still gaps there, and it still continues to be an issue for organisations in terms of advocating to support parents who have children who are older as well, because there is still cliff edges there once your child reaches the age of 14. And then again, more broadly around welfare and income adequacy is, the pandemic has shown, the fact that the higher rate of PUP was introduced was some acknowledgement that social welfare rates are inadequate in meeting a minimum standard of living. And we know that lone parents are more likely to have deep levels of income inadequacy. So I suppose we're trying to shift and move the debate onwards about having a social welfare system that is adequate, that supports people's minimum essential needs, and that no one is cutting back or going without and experiencing very significant hardship when they are in receipt of a social welfare payment. So just in terms of comparisons with other European countries, we know, as I mentioned, Ireland has very high rates of poverty, but generally across Europe, lone parents are generally more likely to be at risk of poverty. But in Ireland, we really stand out in terms of the numbers of parents who are at risk of poverty, in persistent poverty, and experiencing severe deprivation. So for example, in this graph, we see that Ireland has the highest rate of one-parent families who are unable to afford an unexpected expense. So that means the question is, have you a financial buffer of €1,000 to meet an unexpected expense? And almost 80% of lone parents do not have that, and it compares to an EU average of 56%. So if you look at the countries that are doing well in terms of supporting lone parents, they tend to have subsidised childcare, they have adequate pay floors, they have flexible work arrangements, so people can balance their work and family life, and they have effective systems of child maintenance. And they also have comprehensive systems of social protection. And I suppose it's important to say that their policies are gender proofed and gender central, because we know that 86% of lone parent families are headed by a woman, and 99% of people in receipt of the one parent family payment are also women in Ireland as well. So it is a very gender specific issue as well. So I suppose in terms of our advocacy work, it's really important. A lot of time there's still a lot of stigma and often a lack of sympathy towards lone parents, we find in our work. So, we've sought in a number of ways we've commissioned quite a lot of research just to highlight the lived experience of lone parents, as well as having the statistical analysis of how Ireland compares in terms of its living standards that's afforded to lone parent families as well. So I suppose, it's important to us to communicate with policymakers about what it's like to live on a low income and why it's not right that people have to go without or cut back. And I think really it's communicating that when you are on a very low income, it's impossible to plan for the future, because you're trying to deal with day to day and living with the difficulties that can be caused by even just a €10 decrease in your income, and that can tip a family into crisis. So part of the work is really showing the impact that it has on families in a very real way as part of our advocacy work. So this is research that we carried out in 2014 on lone parents' experiences. So that was at the height of the recession, where families were really feeling the effects of austerity and were very worried about the future. So as well as the individual consequences in terms of its impact it has on people's mental and physical health, children's future life chances when their family are having to cut back and go without, and then again this inability to plan for the future. So highlighting those very real individual consequences for families, but also we've sought to highlight the wider consequences. So we commissioned research last year on what is the cost of poverty to the exchequer. So we found that every year the state spends about €4.5 billion dealing with the damage poverty causes on people's lives. So we're trying to make sure that we're putting forward that there's a very moral argument for investing in families and children, but also there's a very strong economic argument as well. So that's, I suppose, just giving you an overview of the issues that came up for us comes up for lone parents and our policy that we work on. And then Karen will just take you up to date in terms of what's been happening with the Lone Parent Alliance and the experience of families through COVID as well. So I'll just stop sharing there and hand over to Karen. Thanks.
Thanks, Tricia. That's great. Excuse me. So I am the CEO of One Family. We're a national organisation that provides family support services to people who are parenting on their own, sharing parenting of their children, going through separation. And we're around since 1972. We were established as Cherish, actually, by a group of women who were not married, who became pregnant and wanted to raise their own children. So we go way back in time. And I suppose, although we're primarily a service provider, we also do try and bring the practice learnings into policy and try to make a difference both at national and international level when we can. Getting policy funded is one of the biggest challenges actually for an NGO, as well as admin and overheads. Nobody wants to pay for it. So one of the things that One Family has found increasingly in the last 5 to 10 years is that it's much more effective and impactful for us to work in partnership with other organisations, particularly because we have a very small, like a half-time role in policy. So one of the things that I've been doing is I sit on the Advisory Council on BOBF, which is Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, and it's the national framework for children and young people. So it's a strategy that ran through until last year. And the council was really concerned about child poverty, and we really tried to prioritise the need for child poverty to be kind of the main lens through which we saw our work. And we are pushing very much in the next iteration of BOBF, which is going to get written this year, that child poverty is a central plank of that. And I suppose one of the reasons One Family sees that this is a very useful way to speak about poverty in one-parent families is that most poor children in Ireland actually live in one-parent families. So it's a way of targeting, and it's a way of being able to collaborate with other organisations. And it is a policy concern at European level as well as national level. So then during COVID, we just found overnight really consistent problems across a number of areas for people living in one-parent families across the country. And the main issue was access and contact visits with the other parent, where there was a pandemic and a very strict lockdown. Then that was being compounded perhaps by abuse. And I suppose we heard instances where the parent with the primary care wouldn't let the children go, where a parent wouldn't return the children from access, and where people were unable to trust each other to work out arrangements. And what was great was the minister, the court service, the president of the district court, the law society, everyone came out with guidance, and we were able to share that, because this is really delicate and the courts were closed and people didn't really have the means to deal with this. Another major issue at the time was around child maintenance, and the fact that where orders were in place, they ended for many people overnight without warning. That was obviously linked to job loss, or perhaps linked to also opportunistic, way to not pay the money. People were worried about becoming ill, potentially dying, not having their wills in order, not having a guardian in place. Parents were very isolated. At that point, there was no bubbling with anyone else. That came later, specifically for one-parent families, which was great. And people lost their jobs overnight. People who'd never been on social welfare suddenly were catapulted into that world. Like, there were issues around printing forms. There were issues around queues in post offices to claim things, children not being allowed in to shops or post offices, really basic stuff. Like, it's hard even now to remember how bad it was a year ago. So, One Family and all the other organisations put in service responses to try and deal with those things, but we also started meeting each other and talking to each other to try and see, could we add value and get things done more quickly? So bit by bit, members joined, but certainly ourselves and St. Vincent de Paul came together very quickly, along with Spark, which is an activist group for single parents, TROR, the National Women's Council, Focus Ireland, Children's Rights Alliance, Bernardo's and FLAC. So they are the 9 members of what is now called the National One Parent Family Alliance. And over the months, we've really tried to focus on certain areas, really around income adequacy and security, childcare, housing, and then the treatment of one-parent families, rather than getting into other areas like family law or other issues. And in the first lockdown, a lot of the issues that we were working on were around food poverty, the need for summer school meals, access to shops, child protection issues, the isolation of families, PUP payments, could people get it along with other social welfare payments? And it was an extraordinary time. I mean, as someone who's been working, trying to engage with policymakers for 20 years or more, this was very different. People worked very rapidly with us. They wanted to solve problems and they had money. So systems were being, the kind of slowness of bureaucracy was not there in the same way. We got a lot of policymakers in different departments who wanted to make things better, which was great. And a lot of the things that we looked for, we got, not all of them perhaps in the way we wanted. But the Department of Taoiseach said at one of the NEFIT briefings, supermarkets had to have a pragmatic approach to shopping. That was because we wrote into them. We managed to work in collaboration with others around the need for summer and Easter school meals, which was new. So it's about us now trying to build, I suppose, on some of the things that we got during COVID. And by the second lockdown in September, we, and Tricia did a lot of the work on this, we wrote a formal submission around some of the areas of concern to us, and then some of the solutions and things we wanted from government. And we sent that to various government committees, as well as ministers and opposition spokespeople. And that was kind of focused on, because what came up over the summer was suddenly there was conditionality around getting PUP, that suddenly had to be available for full-time work, and that wasn't there before. And well, what about people who had to mind their children, and there wasn't anywhere open or enough places open? So after months of work on that, it is now very clear that for people parents, and particularly lone parents who don't have access to childcare, they are entitled to a PUP payment. We also talked to the Department of Social Protection around those people who suddenly lost child maintenance, and they were very flexible, and they said, okay, if someone tells us they've lost child maintenance, we don't need them to go to court or anything, which was an impossibility. We will just put them back on their full payment, because there is a deduction on their social welfare payments, and we'll put them back on for 12 weeks and we'll review it. So those kinds of things just wouldn't happen before. We did a lot of work with them around food, income and energy poverty. We got some things, we didn't get others. I think that's an ongoing piece of work, particularly for SVP. A lot of innovative things were done around the whole area of domestic abuse and violence, and that's, I know there's going to be another seminar with Mary McDermott from Safe Ireland. They did a lot of really good work on that. And we also talked about isolation, the need for more family supports into families, people reaching into homes to make sure that parents in stress were okay and that their children were okay. And then as well as homelessness, because there was a cap on rent increases and evictions, but I suppose we're just concerned to make sure those things don't start to open up yet. So that was kind of September. You know, children went back to school, we had our Christmas, and then we all came back to a massive lockdown. So we met very early in January. We're all really concerned and going, okay, we're back. We've slid back down the snakes and ladders here. We're back at the bottom. So what do we need to do? So again, we pulled together a statement calling for 10 actions around what was needed to make sure that one-parent families didn't get left behind again, and to kind of draw attention to the very specific barriers and that they have. And you could hear from Tricia, like if things were difficult in normal times, they just got much more difficult. And the kinds of things we were calling for was public information campaigns around the access to childcare and around the special rent supplement, which was something introduced at the time. We wanted increased supports around fuel bills and energy, and more. We wanted a targeted increased payment to children who were on social welfare, where their payments were on social welfare. And then we also had specific concern about the Parents' Leave and Benefits bill, and I might come back and talk about that one. So we sent our statement of 10 actions off to all the relevant ministers, to opposition spokespeople. And next thing, the name National One Parent Family Alliance and our issues kept popping up in the Dáil and the Seanad over the last 2 weeks, which was great. And as a result of that, we've now in 2 weeks had meetings with 3 ministers. So Minister Roderick O'Gorman met us about 2 weeks ago and then looked for follow-up briefing papers from us around the national childcare schemes and the difficulties for lone parents there, and also around the parents' leave. A lot of interest from Fine Gael senators and TDs on the Parents' Leave Act, because that's moving through at the moment. So it was really interesting to see, because again, many times you could put things out into the public domain and nothing would happen. So for me, there's something around the timeliness and the importance of these issues, along with the fact there's 9 national organisations all looking for the same thing and collaborating. And I think that's where that has given us, as was a level of authority around these issues, that we have gotten engagement. So I think it was Wednesday we met with Minister Heather Humphreys and Minister Joe O'Brien, and I really think that was probably on the back of what came up in the Dáil and Seanad, although very welcome and very productive meeting. So then the other issues we were looking at around childcare, I suppose we've clarified that for people working from home, even if they're working from home, they're essential workers, they can access childcare. We kind of got a no around the energy increases and the extra support to children, and a no on the formal information campaigns they're sharing through social media, and that's kind of it. So just the parents' leave issue is really interesting. We've been working for a number of years on this, as with other organisations, because this is new paid leave, and I think we have to do it because of Europe. You know, we're way behind. And it's leave that is shared between the mother and father, or indeed 2 parents in a same-sex couple, where each parent has to take half the leave each. And we were saying, well, if you're parenting on your own and there isn't anyone else to take that leave, in fact, the system in Ireland was you'd lose it. And the rationale seemed to be that if we allowed it to be transferred to somebody else, or if we allowed a mother, let's say it'll be probably a new mother, use that payment, then other 2-parent families would defraud the system and want it. And there seems to be some basis for that in other European countries. But there's a lot of interest in this now, and in making sure that that those babies and those children of people parenting alone don't lose out. So we're hopeful now that that will change, and that also that they'll bring in the legislation really quickly, which will give 2 weeks paid leave right now to people who could do with it right now during the lockdown. So I suppose that's a lot of information. We can go back if people have questions around specific aspects of it. But, you know, my message really is that as an organisation that engages in formal policy work and lobbying, we got farther because of this crisis, and we got farther by collaborating and working together and by sharing resources, so it has been really interesting to kind of see it and see how it's unfolded. And, you know, as I said, there was a lot of things we didn't get, but there was a lot of things we did get. And I think we'll end up going back to normal, and perhaps in the future there'll be less funding available for the state to be as generous as it was. But I think we all need to remember how it has been now and what people have been able to do in short time to fix things, and to remember what was possible to do in the future as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and also thank you, Tricia. I know that Karen has to go at to another meeting, so we have about 20-25 minutes for discussion. So if it's a small group, so if you would like to just put up your screen and start asking your question, or if you prefer to raise your hand, whatever suits better. You can also put your camera on at this point. We're fine with the recording, so that's gonna make a nicer environment, I think, for the speaker as well. Great. So is there any question? Shall I start with one?
I might ask a question, if that's all right. I suppose this is kind of more of a big question about, I suppose, the status of lone parents in Ireland, but vis-a-vis the status of lone parents in kind of other countries. And it pertains to, I suppose, when you look at a lot of other countries, even though they do have, you know, better supports, better welfare, and, you know, Tricia's presentation pointed to a lot of the things that are there that are good. But I suppose over recent years, there is an increasing tendency, I think, to move policy in a different direction, and it's kind of away from what I would say is redistribution policy downwards to families who are poor, and a focus on kind of more intrusive surveillance type policy directed at poor families and particularly poor parents. You know, an example is the Troubled Families Programme in England, for example, but there's also other examples in other European countries. And I'm a little bit concerned about, I suppose, what could happen in Ireland, because we do tend to look to other countries in that regard. And I'm just wondering, where do you think we are at in relation to that? Is it still possible to keep the focus on redistribution, and that families, if they're struggling because of poverty and because of, you know, the lack of a welfare state and all of those things, or the degree to which there's a focus on moving professionals in to sort the problems of poor parenting, or whatever they're going to call it? That kind of idea. It's a big question.
If that's okay, Tricia. I love questions like this, because to us, one-parent families are actually, it's very philosophical. People use different languages and identify themselves very differently as different members of different types of one-parent families. So it's very mixed, and it's really interesting. And I think we've just had the Mother and Baby Homes Commission report, and you know, where we are now and where the situation for lone parents and their children is now is built on that. You know, we're the same society, and we have an opportunity, I suppose, to try and do things better and to do things right. And one of the things we've been looking for since our founders founded the organisation 49 years ago is the equality for all families in the Constitution in Article 41.3 to extend rights to all families. But I'm also hearing you're asking about, I mean, surveillance in the social welfare system is quite focused on lone parents, who is staying in their house, who they're sleeping with, how many nights they're in their house. I mean, it can be very intrusive and inappropriate, and that kind of got surfaced with the department over the past year as well. And, you know, those inspections have supposedly stopped. And I think it's one of the things we'll be looking for, is to make sure they don't start again. That the social welfare male breadwinner model is still there. And I suppose in some ways they're trapped in their own policies. And I think there are individuals who you can still hear sometimes implicitly in what they're saying, a judgment around someone who's parenting on their own. And that could have to do with money or sex. I root it back to those two things. And I think there's an opportunity for us to try and explode some of that as a society now, actually. But I would also say that our experience of working around parenting supports and providing services to families is that we've quite a strong positive parenting philosophy in Ireland, certainly at state and NGO level. So we tend to look at a family strengths approach rather than a deficit model. And that is in contrast to other European countries. And the kind of investment we had from philanthropy over the last 20 years has helped build a basis for that at state and who they fund, and that's really helpful. So I'd hope that we would not go to that. And just to say, there's a new policy parenting support unit in the Department of Children. It's there maybe less than 2 years, and they're now doing a national strategy around parenting support and what it should look like. So there is an opportunity to feed into that as well.
Great.
Yeah, if I could just maybe talk about kind of the overarching policy narrative around the state's role in terms of supporting families and what other international countries are doing. I suppose if you speak to policymakers, particularly in Department of Social Protection, they will emphasise the role social transfers play in reducing poverty in Ireland. So if you look at other European countries, our social protection system does a lot of the heavy lifting. And we've got really poor service provision. So then you've got a really high living cost. So parents are left in this situation where, okay, they are on a social welfare transfer that may be lifting them just above the poverty line or to the poverty line, but they have these huge costs that other parents in other countries don't have. And I think it was Kitty Holland did a really good article as part of the No Child 2020 campaign a couple of years ago, where she spoke to a mother in Finland who was parenting alone and a mother in Ireland who was parenting alone, and just the massive difference in terms of what services were available to families. And I suppose that the emphasis on services is really important, but I suppose you can't underestimate the important role income plays. You can kind of decompartmentalize poverty into food poverty, period poverty, energy poverty, but at the end of the day, it's lack of income. So from our point of view, it's really important to say you need adequate income, but you also need the services. And I think just that idea around perception and public perception and how that influences policy is really important. So, for example, we would have to combat the idea that people are struggling financially, not because they're bad money managers, it's because they don't have enough money. And some of the best money managers we know would be lone parents who know down to the exact cent how much money they have till tomorrow or the next day to get the family through. So I think that idea that it's about tackling poor parenting is just not the direction we want to go down. It's about supporting families and having a strong welfare system. And I hope through the pandemic, we've seen the strong role the state has and is needed to do that. So I would be hopeful that we don't end up in that kind of narrative and that we can build back better in terms of services and income supports.
Great.
Is there any other question from? I'm just curious about this whole homelessness issue that you mentioned, that many one-parent family are finding themselves homeless. Was this something that deteriorated further during the pandemic? How did it change? Because I knew that this was a crisis already before, right? The housing crisis. So how did it change during the last lockdowns?
I suppose just in terms of why, some of the reasons why lone parents are overrepresented among the homeless population. I think in the past, the availability obviously of social housing gave families that security, and then the shift to giving subsidies to people in the private rented sector, and then once the rent increases, housing shortages became apparent, lone parents were disproportionately represented among those in the private rented sector, which made them very vulnerable. And now we have a situation where lone parents are overrepresented among the homeless population. But what has happened actually through the pandemic, and I suppose like throughout the housing crisis that preceded the public health crisis, there was huge push for rent controls, greater tenancy protections. And what's happened now with the eviction ban and the rent controls, the numbers of families in homeless accommodation has actually declined significantly, because the entry into it has stopped, but also because there's been more availability of properties. Families have been able to move out of homelessness more easily. Now, the number of single adults during the pandemic who are homeless has actually increased, but family homelessness has declined. So again, it's about taking that learning from the pandemic and, you know, implementing it afterwards to say, look, these kind of protections are helping families, so we should try and continue as much of that as possible. Yeah.
Just to say, many of those single adults may well be dads who are sharing parenting of their children, and they then are left in really difficult circumstances in terms of not having a space to spend time with their children or to have normal living and parenting time with them. So when people separate, you know, as we know, the assets, there just isn't enough to go around, and frequently dads end up in overcrowded situations or homeless, and you know, and mums do too. 65% of homeless families are a single mother with one or two children. So it's a really tough thing for both mums and dads. We see that some local authorities have tried to not assess dads, particularly dads, but it could be mothers as well, who just have their children part of the time. So there was a case taken against Dublin City Council last year that IREC was involved in, and they won. So, you know, that is not okay anymore. And I suppose what we would see is this slightly different issue, but there's a real lack of understanding on the behalf of the state, and you'd see it mostly around housing and social protection, around the reality of shared parenting and the fact that for many children they live with both their parents separately. They may live with them equal time, they may live with them quite different amounts of time, but those parents are active people in their lives, and that relationship needs to be supported. And we're way behind in Ireland in understanding how to do that. We still see it as very black and white. You know, a woman on social welfare with a child will support them. Once they start sleeping with someone, it is their responsibility. You know, so it's a terribly old-fashioned, outmoded way of thinking about things, and that really needs to change. But housing is a really interesting one for people going through separation and divorce. People in negative equity, they are locked into terrible mortgages, into terrible situations, and they're going to end up relying on the state, because a lot of the state schemes are closed to them because they're not first-time buyers. So there's a whole suite of issues around that. So it's very tough.
Could I just ask you about, you mentioned before your presentation, Karen, about Spark. And I just thought it was interesting that you said that they could kind of make inroads maybe where other organisations can't. And maybe it's to do with the fact that they're, you know, organic, representing themselves in that regard. And maybe also there's quite a lot of emotion in what they're experiencing at that particular point in time. I'm just wondering, what is the place for kind of grassroots type organic organizations representing themselves vis-a-vis maybe the more NGO sector, and how can that work, and how do you think you can help each other and be good advocates in different kinds of ways for what you want to achieve?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that about 10 or 15 years ago, someone said to us as one family, he said, now your membership will become more radical than you, and that's okay, you know. So I thought that's really interesting, because of course, as you grow and professionalize as an organization, you've got, you know, to be accountable for your money. Now, I will say we were never, ever discouraged from saying anything due to our funding. I will just say that. I think in some sectors that does happen. That has never happened for one family. But I suppose when Budget 2012 happened and all the cuts and reforms that were aimed at lone parents happened, Spark happened overnight, and it was really interesting to see. Louise Bayliss, who was one of the founders, is still involved, and then she also works for Focus Ireland, and we work really, really well together. She's on the Alliance, and I think she would have a really unique perspective on their journey and how that happened. But I suppose from one family's perspective, we really wanted to establish a relationship with them. We wanted to figure out how we could support what they were doing that was different to what we were doing, and we saw value in being able to say things in a different way. And and that was okay, and that they, even though we have, because I suppose for a lot of our service users, we're highly protective of asking them to give their stories as case studies or anything. So there's a more immediate thing. If you're part of an activist group and you want to do that, that's your choice. So there's a different relationship, if you will, with membership versus service users. So I think looking back, we've really made it work. I think that's evidence now. I think Spark has changed and its role has changed, and the founders there would have more to say about it. But I just think collaboration is the way to go. And I, you know, some people may not realize our sector is highly competitive. And if you can form, and it's often based on personal relationships, you can try and overcome that. And the benefits are massive. So I really welcome people saying things in a different way once everyone understands it. We don't all have to say it the same way. In fact, it's better if we don't all say it the same way. And we can say things in a room, insider, and you can say something outsider, and they'll all work together. That's the idea anyway, if you can do that.
I think Helen had a question. You are muted though, so
yeah, it's kind of a question, a comment. I'm working with the school completion programme in inner city Dublin, and it's linked with the comments about homelessness. And one of the things that we've encountered just in this third lockdown, families that are homeless, that are in hotel accommodation, if they test positive, they're moved immediately. And I'm working with one family, and because of COVID, they've been moved into a really lovely 3-bedroom apartment, and they sit out their isolation there back to the kind of fairly grim hotel room that they're living in. And it's an interesting conversation because it's kind of, they've seen that there are apartments available, that it is possible to have an alternative to living in a hotel with bunk beds on the wall. And it's suddenly, I'm interested in the information about the organisation called Spark, but I just think that this is possibly an experience of a lot of homeless families at the moment, that they're suddenly seeing there is housing stock available if you get infected. So why isn't it available? You know, it's not really a question, it's just a comment.
No, it's really interesting, and I suppose one of the things that struck me over the last few years is how many people doing long courses with us, like year-long courses with us, their address would be room 201, and such, you know, and you're thinking you're doing your coursework there, you've got children, and
you're doing everything.
You're doing everything there. And it's really poignant, you know, and we'd be sending Santa presents and, you know, whatever it might be, and you're thinking, God, they came in and they did all that work living in a hotel room. So yeah, your point is really interesting about housing stock. And look, it's a policy, it's a willingness. Do we really want to house people or not? And what are we willing to do for it? Are we going to protect landlords? It's that age old.
Yeah, I suppose that, you know, that would be a big issue for our volunteers who do visit people who are in hotels, and just trying like to do homeschooling in one room, and the stress families are under is incredible. You know, it's not even about digital devices, it's actually just space and inequalities and access to space to study. And that goes for as well families in direct provision as well who would we support. You know, it's very, very, very difficult, and you know, there's huge concern about the impact on that. And again, it is the will, it is all comes down to will, you know, and being told that you can't do these things, we're kind of not going to accept that now. That, you know, because we've seen what has been possible. Not that we would have accepted it in the past, but you know, there's evidence now that things can be done and things can be shifted. Nothing is insurmountable, I suppose. Yeah.
My sense is that I think it's possibly adding another layer of a kind of combination of anger and hopelessness onto families that are already terribly put upon. And it was just so hard to have a conversation with one of them the other day, because she's just so angry that they were able to get this apartment because her daughter got infected, and she couldn't get beyond it, that, you know, we've been in a hotel for a long time and suddenly they're telling me lies, you know, the housing workers telling me lies, and, you know, we're trying to kind of encourage stuff about education, but it's just, I just feel there's a whole kind of new level of reasons for people to be put down a bit more, because they've seen the promised land, and then they're back to, well, you haven't got this and you haven't got that, and you're on a housing list and you're number 3,000 or whatever. And they're saying, well, no, it's not like that, because we know there's a flat there. We lived in it for 2 weeks over in Thomas Street or wherever it was, you know. And I just hadn't seen this coming.
Yeah, there's no answer to that.
No, sorry. Yeah.
To accept that, you know, the systems got altered, and then it's about trying to build on that, and it's our jobs to go back and say, you did that, let's keep going. Yeah.
Liz, you're mute. I think you're trying to...
No, I was just going to say it's a really good comment, but I would hope that that anger can be taken a positive place, you know, because we should all be standing up and saying this is not good enough. You know, I think we all have an onus now to say we saw what it was like during the pandemic, and we are not going back to that place where we were at in that context. And I think we all have a duty as a society to look at how we can make things happen for poorer people into the future, recognising what was possible during the pandemic and how we sustain that legacy. I think is a real challenge for us as a society now going forward. You know, so I hope that people stay angry and use that anger to fight for what we deserve in society and what we need and what we want our society to be like.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, but I think there's going to be so much anger over a recession among the middle classes when this is over, that kind of bed and breakfast families will be back down where they always are. But I do agree with you, and I'm interested in the information about Spark, so I might see if we can just feed in a little bit there, but let's live in hope.
The best way to find them is on Facebook. They have a closed Facebook group.
Okay, thank you.
You find them there, and they're also on Twitter. So it's Spark Ireland is the one.
I think we're almost at closing time, but if you want to have a final comment, Tricia and Karen, and then I think we will close it off because I know you have to go.
Yeah, apologies.
I'd like to say thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much for taking part in the webinar, and it was very insightful, and I hope to see you soon again in one of our meetings, and have a nice day, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us.